Hey guys, tonight we're doing something a little different. You've survived modern construction sites with their safety regulations, coffee breaks, and usher inspectors who actually care if you die. So yeah, you probably won't survive this either. But let's pretend it's 1570, you're in Ming Dynasty, China, and you've just been conscripted to build the Great Wall during winter. Because nothing says career advancement like hauling frozen stones up a mountain while the wind personally auditions to murder you. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'm not going to chase you with sticky rice mortar over it. And hey, drop your city and the time you're watching this down in the comments. I love knowing who else is awake during these quiet hours, probably thankful they're not carrying bricks in temperatures that make Antarctica look like a spa vacation. Now dim the lights, maybe grab that weighted blanket that doesn't smell like centuries of construction dust and frozen despair. Let's ease into tonight's journey together. The conscription notice arrives like bad news wrapped in official paperwork, impersonal, inevitable, and completely uninterested in your winter farming plans or that persistent cough you've been developing since harvest season. You stand in your village square watching names get called, faces draining colour faster than wine from a cracked cup in a snowstorm. Congratulations, you've won the lottery. Nobody entered. Great Wall construction duty during the season when even wolves have the common sense to stay in their dens and complain about the weather like sensible creatures. You might not realise this is technically an honour, though the imperial official reading the list certainly emphasises that part with the enthusiasm of someone selling swampland during a flood. What he conveniently forgets to mention is that honour, in this context, is spelled with frozen fingers, tastes like industrial strength regret, and comes with a side order of probable death. Here's a historical fact that definitely won't improve your mood. Wall building spanned multiple dynasties, conscripting everyone from soldiers to criminals to regular people who pissed off the wrong tax collector during rice wine season. It's like the world's longest, coldest group project where nobody gets to opt out, the deadline is whenever, and the presentation involves potentially becoming a frozen statue on a mountainside. Different eras, same basic concept, take people who'd rather be literally anywhere else and make them stack bricks in weather that makes penguins reconsider their life choices and apply for jobs in warmer climates. The march north begins in autumn, when leaves turn colours that remind you of home, warmth, and other concepts you're about to become deeply nostalgic for. You walk in lines stretching for miles, carrying everything you own, which after taxation and supply requisition amounts to a bedroll, spare cloth, and crushing existential dread. It's like the world's worst road trip where there's no music, no snacks, everyone's walking, and the destination is suffering with scenic views of your own mortality. TripAdvisor would give it 1 star, and that star would be for the landscape grudgingly given before the reviewer died of exposure. You're walking with a fascinating cross-section of society. Criminals who thought stealing rice was a good idea, debtors who learned that imperial loans come with creative collection methods, and regular folks who had the misfortune of being born with working backs during construction season. Think of it as ancient China's version of community service, except the community is a frozen ridge and the service involves not falling off. Here's a historical fact about workforce management that'll make your modern HR department weep. Different dynasties had different recruitment strategies, but they all shared one core principle: get as many workers as possible to the wall as cheaply as possible, with possible being a very flexible concept. The Qin were refreshingly direct about it, just mass conscripting like it was going out of style. The Ming tried to be more systematic with rotational labour programs that looked great on paper and functioned like a medieval DMV in practice. Both approaches had identical results. Lots of cold, unhappy people discovering that bricks are significantly heavier than they look and that mountains don't negotiate. Records on casualty rates are about as reliable as weather predictions made by looking at bird entrails, mainly because keeping accurate books during everyone's dying of exposure moments wasn't high on the administrative priority list. Some imperial histories frame deaths as necessary sacrifice, like breaking eggs for a very large, very national omelette that nobody actually wanted to eat. Others hint at administrative failures, written in the careful language of officials who didn't want to be next on the winter assignment list. It's bureaucratic passive-aggressiveness preserved in stone tablets for historians to puzzle over centuries later. You pass checkpoints where officials count bodies like inventory, checking manifests against reality, subtracting those who didn't make it past the first mountain pass, making notes that will probably get filed under someone else's problem in the Imperial Archives. Someone ahead asks about pay. The official's laughter answers that question more thoroughly than any policy manual ever written. The landscape changes as you travel north, and not in the fun vacation postcard way. Trees thin out, replaced by scrub, rock, and eventually just wind with strong opinions about your life choices and the audacity of your continued existence. Temperature drops in increments you measure by how many layers you're wearing simultaneously. Somewhere around all of them plus that dead guy's coat, you realise this is just the approach march. The actual wall will be colder, higher, and significantly less interested in your survival than the increasingly hostile terrain you're currently traversing. Listen to your boots crunch through frost that sounds like breaking promises. Feel how your breath turns to fog that immediately freezes to your scarf, creating a personal ice sculpture of your own mortality. Taste the metallic bite of air so cold it makes your teeth ache in solidarity with your rapidly numbing extremities. You might not realise how weather becomes the main character in this story, with moods ranging from mildly homicidal to actively planning your funeral with disturbing attention to detail. Veterans, the ones who survived previous construction seasons and developed that 1,000-yard stare that comes from seeing too many co-workers become ice sculptures, share advice in quiet moments. Don't wet your gloves, don't breathe through your mouth unless you enjoy the sensation of inhaling frozen knives. Don't count the remaining mountains. It's like counting sheep, except these sheep want to kill you and have been practicing. That last piece of advice proves impossible to follow. The peaks stretch ahead like accusations written in stone, each one a reminder that whoever planned this route had either never walked it personally or possessed a deeply sadistic sense of humour. You arrive at base camp where the Great Wall looms above like a stone dragon with serious commitment issues, unfinished, sprawling, demanding, and utterly indifferent to your feelings about vertical construction projects in sub-zero weather. The camp itself looks like someone took the concept of temporary housing and decided to stress test it against the worst weather patterns Earth could produce. Tents flap in wind that sounds like the mountain clearing its throat before delivering bad news. Smoke rises from cooking fires that seem to be fighting a losing battle against the elements. Foremen bark assignments with the charm of caffeinated drill sergeants who've had their morning rice wine replaced with liquid disappointment. Tools get distributed like weapons in a war nobody signed up for. Someone hands you a hammer that's seen better decades and possibly better centuries, the handle worn smooth by countless hands that are no longer attached to living bodies. Here's a fun historical fact. Ming Dynasty construction management operated on the principle that workers were replaceable, tools were expensive, and schedules were suggestions that reality could safely ignore. Quality control consisted of, does it stay up long enough for the inspector to leave? And workplace safety was whatever prayers you could mumble while lifting stones. You look up at the ridge where tomorrow's work waits, exposed to weather that doesn't negotiate with construction schedules, imperial ambitions, or your personal desire to keep all your fingers. The wall threads through terrain that looks like Earth tried origami while heavily intoxicated and gave up halfway through the folding process. It's like trying to build a highway through a blender, while the blender is running and someone keeps adding ice cubes made of pure hostility. Watchtowers punctuate the ridgeline like exclamation points in a very long, very cold sentence about imperial overconfidence. You count 17 visible from where you stand, each representing hundreds of workers who thought, surely this is the last tower, only to discover the wall's definition of finished was more aspirational than mathematical. The air tastes like regret mixed with iron filings, sharp enough to make your teeth file formal complaints with your brain. Steam rises from your mouth in puffs that immediately crystallize and fall like the world's most depressing snow globe. Listen to the constant symphony of construction sounds. Hammers ringing against stone, saws biting through wood. The occasional creative cursing in dialects you didn't know existed, and underneath it all, the wind's persistent commentary on the futility of human ambition. You're assigned to a work crew led by a foreman whose idea of motivation involves creative threats and detailed descriptions of what happens to workers who don't meet quotas. His face has the weathered look of someone who's spent years arguing with mountains and occasionally winning. "You see those bricks?" he says, pointing to a pile of rectangular stones that look suspiciously like frozen loaves of bread. "Those need to get up there." He points to a section of wall that appears to be located somewhere near the moon. Before the mortar freezes, which it will, because physics doesn't care about your feelings. Here's your introduction to the miracle of logistics. Every brick, every bucket of mortar, every tool, every piece of wood has to be carried up slopes that would challenge a mountain goat with excellent health insurance. There are no elevators, no conveyor belts, no helpful equipment, invented by people who understood that human backs have structural limitations. Just you, gravity, and the growing realization that whoever designed this construction project had never actually tried to carry anything heavier than a writing brush up a mountain in winter weather. Your bunk is a wooden platform in a tent shared with 7 other men who smell like they have been marinated in construction dust and frozen despair. Their blankets are thin, scratchy, and appear to have been designed by someone who confused insulation with decorative suggestion. Sleep comes fitfully, interrupted by the wind that sounds like the mountain practicing its intimidation techniques, and the occasional groan from the tent structure that suggests even the shelter has doubts about this whole enterprise. Tomorrow brings the actual work. Tonight brings one more sunset you got to see without carrying a brick up a frozen mountain while questioning every life choice that led to this maunt. That's what passes for a victory around here. You wake to the sound of someone trying to convince a cooking fire to stay interested in wood while the wind argues back with the persistence of a customer service complaint that's been escalated to management, reviewed by committee, and returned marked insufficient suffering. The cold doesn't just wake you up. It conducts a comprehensive audit of every joint, muscle, and extremity, filing detailed reports on which parts of your body are still functional and which have filed for early retirement during the night. Your breath forms clouds thick enough to provide actual concealment from supervisors, which would be useful if you had anywhere to hide on a ridge that offers all the privacy of a dinner plate balanced on a flagpole. Here's your first lesson in Great Wall construction logistics. Everything that needs to happen requires fire, water, or both, and both fire and water have strong opinions about cooperating in temperatures that make ice cubes feel overdressed. The mess tent serves something that's technically porridge, though it requires a generous interpretation of both porridge and food. It tastes like boiled sadness with hints of whatever the cook could scrape from the bottom of storage containers that have seen better dynasties. It's like trying to run a restaurant where the kitchen is outside, the ingredients freeze overnight, and the customers are rocks that need to be carried uphill before service. Gordon Ramsay would have a complete psychological breakdown and apply for jobs in warmer, saner industries. You wrap your hands around a bowl that provides roughly the same amount of warmth as holding a moderately enthusiastic ice cube. The porridge itself has the consistency of liquid disappointment and the flavour profile of, "We tried, but physics disagreed with our menu plans." Still, you eat it because calories are currency here, and you're about to spend your body weight in energy-hauling building materials upgrades that would make roller coaster designers reconsider their career choices. Listen to the morning sounds, metal tools ringing against stone, the scrape of shovels against frozen ground, the soft cursing of men who've discovered that leather gloves become rigid at temperatures where human flesh starts making poor life decisions. The sun makes a token appearance, painting everything gold in that particular light that makes even frozen misery look picturesque from a safe distance. It's nature's Instagram filter applied to historical suffering, and it will last approximately 15 minutes before clouds roll in to remind everyone that this is serious business. Here's a historical fact that won't improve your day. Winter crews used ice as infrastructure, deliberately wetting slopes to freeze roads for dragging stones upward. It's brilliant engineering that turns physics into a slippery accomplice, until you realise the same ice that helps move materials becomes the skating rink where one wrong step turns your workday into an unscheduled flying lesson down a white gully that doesn't bother with exit interviews. You strap on what passes for work boots, leather affairs that have been waterproofed with animal fat and optimism. They provide roughly the same traction as buttered ice skates, but they're what you have, and complaining about equipment has been added to the list of activities that result in reduced rations. The workday begins before your eyes have fully adjusted to being open. Teams organise around specific tasks. Stone cutters, mortar mixers, haulers, and the unfortunate souls assigned to quality control, which means standing on partially completed sections of wall in wind that's actively trying to relocate you to the valley below. Your assignment today is hauling. This involves picking up objects that weigh more than you do and carrying them up slopes that appear to have been designed by someone who confused challenging with potentially lethal and decided to err on the side of maximum suffering. The stones themselves are cut granite, each one shaped like a brick but with the weight and personality of a small vindictive boulder. They're cold enough to burn exposed skin and heavy enough to remind you that human spines have structural limitations that gravity doesn't respect. You hoist your first load and discover that your back has opinions about this job that it hadn't shared during the interview process. Every step becomes a negotiation between forward progress and structural integrity, conducted in a language of groans, creaks, and the occasional involuntary prayer to any deity who might be monitoring workplace safety violations. The path up to the construction site isn't really a path so much as a suggestion carved into rock by people who are apparently part mountain goat. It switchbacks up the ridge like the mountain's attempt at a cruel joke, offering magnificent views of exactly how far you would fall if your foot placement becomes even slightly optimistic. Halfway up, you pause to catch breath that immediately turns into a personal weather system, complete with precipitation and visibility issues. Below you, the base camp looks like a collection of toys arranged by a child with a limited imagination. Above you, the wall section you're approaching looks like it was designed by someone who thought impossible was just another word for challenging. This is your life now, carrying impossible weights up impossible grades to build an impossible wall in impossible weather. And somehow thousands of people before you did exactly this and created something that still stands today, which either speaks to human determination or suggests that our ancestors were significantly more stubborn than common sense would recommend. You wake before dawn in a camp that sounds like a percussion ensemble of chattering teeth and suppressed whimpering conducted by wind, that's apparently graduated from the Advanced Hostility program at Nature's School of Making Humans Miserable. Snow crunches under boots as teams prep sledges in a silence that feels like collective prayer through clenched jaws. The cold doesn't just bite, it conducts a full oral examination of your sinuses without anesthesia, while your breath forms clouds thick enough to provide actual concealment from the work supervisors who seem immune to weather-related suffering. Steam rises from kettles that smell faintly of rice and lime. Yesterday's mortar ingredients doing double duty as breakfast because waste not, want not, freeze a lot is apparently the official meal planning philosophy around here. Here's a historical fact that actually demonstrates human ingenuity rising to meet impossible circumstances. Ming engineers used winter ice roads and water-lubricated sledges to haul massive stones, a technique proven effective for mega projects like the Forbidden City, where they had the sense to build somewhere that wasn't actively trying to kill them. They'd dig wells along routes to pour water and keep sledges gliding on engineered ice highways. It's environmental engineering with a side of hypothermia and a garnish of, this seems like a terrible idea that might actually work. You might not realise it yet, but turning water into infrastructure is the kind of brilliant insanity that makes mountains negotiable without waiting for spring to forgive your schedule. It's like convincing gravity to take a coffee break while you rearrange the furniture, except the furniture weighs several tons and the coffee break might kill you. It's Amazon Prime for rocks, except the delivery drivers are conscripts. The warehouse is a frozen mountain. The delivery route was designed by someone who failed geography, and customer satisfaction surveys aren't distributed because customers have more pressing concerns like not becoming part of the landscape. The technique works through physics that would make a skating rink jealous. Water poured on ice at near freezing temperatures creates a lubricating film that drops friction to almost nothing. Small teams could move massive loads across prepared paths without reinventing the wheel, or more importantly, without using wheels at all in terrain that would laugh at wheels before feeding them to the local wildlife. But here's the catch that the engineering manuals forgot to mention in the fine print. The same ice that makes your load glide like it's on a magical carpet also turns every step into a negotiation with gravity conducted in a language you don't speak fluently, using vocabulary that consists entirely of curse words and sudden prayers. The margin between momentum and missing persons is sometimes the thickness of a glove's grip on a frozen rope, which explains why work crews developed that particular shade of paranoia that comes from knowing that physics is actively monitoring your performance and grading on a curve that ends in a ravine. You watch teams coordinate this frozen ballet with the precision of people who understand that fucking up means everyone goes sliding down the mountain together like the world's most deadly conga line. Buckets of water, timing that would make Swiss clockmakers weep with envy, and teamwork that emerges when everyone shares the common goal of not becoming geological features. Listen to the near silent rasp of wood on ice, the careful counting, sand push, the soft thud of massive stones settling onto runners designed by people who understood that wood and rope can achieve miracles when properly motivated by the fear of death. Here's the engineering reality that makes modern logistics look simple. Ice roads required constant maintenance, perfect timing, and weather cooperation. 3 things that winter considers optional suggestions rather than requirements. Routes needed wells spaced strategically like gas stations on a highway to hell, men assigned to water duty like they were maintaining life support systems, and backup plans for when physics decided to take a personal interest in your project. The daily rhythm becomes hypnotic in the way that repetitive tasks do when survival depends on getting them right. Fill buckets from wells that freeze over between uses, haul water to the route, pour carefully to maintain the ice film, return for stones, load sledges with weights that make you question the structural integrity of human vertebrae, coordinate the pull, breathe carefully because the air hurts and your lungs have filed formal complaints about working conditions. You might smile at the absurdity if your face wasn't frozen into whatever expression it wore when the temperature dropped below optimistic. Ancient logistics powered by scripts and controlled falling. It's the kind of innovation that happens when desperation meets lunch break and accidentally invents solutions that work better than they have any right to. Your first day on ice road duty starts with instructions delivered by a foreman who's clearly spent years perfecting his ability to sound disappointed in humanity as a general concept. "Water makes ice slippery," he announces with the air of someone sharing revolutionary scientific knowledge. "Ice makes stones move. Stones that don't move stay here. You that don't help stones move also stay here permanently." It's a workplace safety briefing that covers all the essential points with admirable efficiency. The sledges themselves are engineering marvels born from necessity and seasoned with the kind of practical innovation that emerges when your choices are make it work, or become a cautionary tale for future workers. Heavy wooden runners, reinforced with iron when available, designed to glide across prepared ice while carrying loads that would make modern forklift operators file for workers' compensation. Here's a historical detail that puts modern supply chain logistics into perspective. Teams could move stones weighing several tons using nothing but rope, coordination, and the kind of group determination that emerges when the alternative is explaining to imperial supervisors why the construction schedule has encountered technical difficulties. The stones themselves have personalities. Large ones that require entire crews, medium ones that can be handled by pairs of workers who have learned to communicate through grunts and pointing, and small ones that are merely backbreaking rather than potentially fatal to move. You're assigned to a medium stone crew with 3 other men whose names you learn through the practical communication method of you grab that end and watch out for the too late. Teamwork develops quickly when everyone understands that coordination errors result in crushed feet, herniated backs, or surprise lessons in applied physics taught by gravity at high velocity. The ice roads themselves are infrastructure masterpieces that would impress modern highway engineers if they could see past the obvious safety violations and complete disregard for OSHA regulations that hadn't been invented yet. Routes follow the natural contours of the mountain, switch backing up grades that make pack mules reconsider their career choices. Each section requires different water application techniques. More water on steep sections to maintain lubrication, less water on flat areas to prevent complete loss of control, and careful attention to wind patterns that can freeze your maintenance water before it hits the ground. It's like maintaining a bobsled track that's also a delivery route for building materials, where the bobsleds are loaded with stones, the track crews are freezing to death, the finish line is a construction site that's actively trying to fall down the mountain. The work rhythm becomes meditative in the way that dangerous, repetitive tasks do when you're too cold to think about anything else. Check the ice. Apply water where needed. Load the sledge with scientific precision that balances weight distribution against the probability that the whole thing will tip over and take you with it. Coordinate the pull with hand signals that have evolved from ready to complex communications about rock placement and imminent disaster. Listen to the sounds. The scrape of wood on ice that sounds like whispered complaints. The creak of rope under tension that makes everyone hold their breath. The soft thud of stone settling that means the load is secure and won't be rearranging itself during transport. The careful counting that keeps everyone synchronized. Yeah, sad, go. You discover that your body has opinions about this work that it hadn't shared during recruitment. Your back develops a permanent curve designed for lifting stones. Your hands acquire a grip strength that comes from holding rope attached to objects that really don't want to be moved uphill. Your legs learn to walk on ice without these. Kind of confidence that leads to overestimating your traction capabilities. The ice itself becomes a character in this operation. Good ice that grips your boots while letting the sledges glide feels like cooperation from the universe. Bad ice that's too smooth or too rough or has opinions about wind direction becomes an active opponent in a game where the stakes are measured in crushed limbs and projectile construction materials. Here's what the engineering manuals don't mention. Ice roads have moods. Morning ice that's crisp and cooperative. Afternoon ice that gets slushy and unreliable. Evening ice that hardens into treacherous perfection. Night ice that's so cold it burns exposed skin and makes steel tools ring like bells when they're dropped. Weather changes everything with the unpredictability of a supervisor with authority issues. Wind that helps cool overheated workers also freezes the water before it can create proper road surface. Snow that provides insulation also conceals dangerous spots where the ice is thin, or where previous crews have left obstacles that weren't worth removing at the time. Temperature fluctuations turn road maintenance into a constant battle against physics that doesn't care about construction schedules. Too warm and the roads become slush that stops sledges like quicksand. Too cold and the ice becomes so hard that stones bounce rather than slide. While the runners crack underloads they handled perfectly well the day before. By your third week on ice road duty, you've developed the kind of respect for physics that comes from watching it demonstrate its principles, using your co-workers as visual aids. The mountain teaches lessons with the directness of a teacher who doesn't believe in second chances, and graduation requirements include not becoming part of the landscape. Today's assignment involves moving the largest stones yet. Blocks of granite that were clearly cut by people who confused challenging with probably impossible, and decided to err on the side of making future generations question their ancestors' sanity. These stones require the full team, 8 men, 2 sledges, and a coordination effort that would make professional athletes weep with respect. Each block weighs more than your entire crew combined, and moving them requires the kind of teamwork that emerges when everyone understands that individual mistakes become group disasters. Here's a historical fact that puts ancient engineering into perspective. Some of the stones used in Great Wall construction weighed over a ton each, and had to be moved using techniques that relied entirely on human power, rope technology, and the kind of mathematical precision that comes naturally to people who can't afford to be wrong. The preparation alone takes most of the morning. Ice roads must be inspected for weak spots, water levels checked and adjusted, rope conditions verified by people who understand that equipment failure at the wrong moment turns routine work into impromptu funeral arrangements. The sledges themselves require engineering modifications, additional runners to distribute weight, rope systems that allow multiple teams to pull in coordination, braking mechanisms that consist mainly of prayer and the strategic placement of men with wooden poles who volunteered for the job of emergency deceleration specialists. It's like moving a small building using nothing but a shopping cart, rope, and the kind of optimism that borders on mental illness. Except the shopping cart is made of wood, the rope is made from whatever materials were available, and the building actively wants to roll downhill at terminal velocity. Loading the stones requires choreography that would impress ballet companies if ballet involved objects that could crush dancers flat without changing expression. Every movement must be coordinated, every shift in weight anticipated, every possibility for catastrophic failure planned around with the kind of attention to detail that comes from understanding that oops is not an acceptable last word. You position yourself at what's theoretically the safest spot, a relative term when you're dealing with objects that could turn you into a historical footnote with minimal effort. The stone looms above like a geological judgment on your life choices, cold enough to steal heat through your gloves, and heavy enough to make you question the structural integrity of the mountain itself. Listen to the careful communication. Lift on 3, 1, 2, wait, the rope's slipping. Reset position. Check the runners. Is everyone ready? No, but let's do it anyway because standing here isn't making it lighter. The lift itself happens in slow motion, partly because of the weight involved, and partly because everyone's brain is running overtime calculating trajectories and escape routes. The stone rises with the reluctance of something that's perfectly happy being a geological feature and sees no reason to become building material. Your muscles scream protests in languages you didn't know they spoke. Your back files formal complaints about working conditions that violate several laws of physics. Your legs discover that they have structural limitations that weren't mentioned in the job description. But somehow, impossibly, the stone settles onto the sledge with a thud that sounds like victory mixed with relief and seasoned with the knowledge that now you have to move this mountain-sized object up an actual mountain without killing anyone in the process. The pull requires timing that would make musicians jealous. 8 men, 2 ropes, and a coordination effort that turns grown adults into a single organism dedicated to the proposition that objects at rest can be convinced to become objects in motion through the application of sufficient stubbornness. Yeah. San, pull! The sledge doesn't want to move. Physics suggests that maybe this wasn't such a good idea after all. Your muscles inform your brain that they're filing for immediate retirement, but slowly, grudgingly, with the reluctance of something that's been perfectly comfortable being stationary, the massive load begins to glide forward. The sensation is like nothing else. Several tons of stone moving with the grace of a skating dancer, gliding up slopes that should be impossible, defying gravity through nothing more than ice, teamwork, and the kind of human determination that makes mountains reconsider their position on being immovable objects. You're moving history, literally. Each stone will become part of a structure that will outlast the empire that built it, outlast the political systems that demanded it, outlast everyone involved in its construction. And right now, at this moment, it's moving up a mountain because 8 men decided that impossible was just another word for requires more rope. The ice road stretches ahead like a challenge written in frozen water. Behind you, base camp looks like a collection of toys. Above you, the wall section grows larger with each step and each pull, each coordinated effort that turns individual workers into something capable of moving mountains 1 stone at a time. This is your life now, defying gravity through ice physics and teamwork, building something impossible using techniques that shouldn't work but do, proving daily that human stubbornness is a force of nature that can relocate geological features through the application of sufficient determination and really good rope. You crouch beside a joint where brick meets brick, and the seam between them looks like a scar that healed with attitude, a pale thread in red-brown fabric that refuses to split even when the sky's breath turns to knives and the temperature makes steel tools ring like funeral bells. Here's the historical fact that'll blow your mind and possibly save your life. Ming builders mixed sticky rice with lime to create composite mortar whose starch components help control crystal growth, improve water resistance, and maintain cohesion across centuries. It's chemistry that decided to outlive empires just to prove a point about proper ingredient ratios. The sticky rice isn't just some weird ancient superstition, it's legitimate material science that modern engineers are still trying to reverse engineer with the kind of respect usually reserved for technologies that shouldn't work but somehow do anyway. The amylopectin in rice starch creates a polymer network that makes the mortar flexible, waterproof, and strong enough to laugh at earthquakes. You might not realize that winter changes the rules of everything, including how mortar behaves when exposed to temperatures that make water molecules reconsider their liquid state. Low temperatures slow chemical reactions, shrink patients to microscopic levels, and tempt foremen to push schedules that chemistry refuses to honour, without charging interest in the form of hairline cracks that appear. Later, like delayed karma with structural consequences, it's like trying to bake cookies in a freezer. Technically possible if you understand the science, adjust your expectations, and don't mind waiting until the next dynasty for results, but requiring the kind of patience that most construction deadlines don't accommodate. The mortar mixing happens in sheltered areas where fires provide enough heat to keep the ingredients from freezing solid before they can be combined. You watch experienced workers measure rice that's been ground to powder, lime that's been carefully prepared, and water that's heated just enough to prevent immediate crystallization into ice sculptures. Listen to the sounds of preparation, the scrape of wooden paddles against mixing bowls, the soft hiss of steam rising from heated water, the careful conversations between workers who understand that getting the ratios wrong means starting over with materials that are too precious to waste on amateur chemistry experiments. The mixing process itself is an art form that would impress modern chemists if they could see past the obvious safety violations and complete lack of laboratory conditions. Rice powder gets incorporated gradually, lime added in measured amounts, water heated to precise temperatures that are determined by experience rather than thermometers. Here's what the ancient engineering manuals didn't mention because they assumed everyone would understand. Even Miracle Mortar hates being rushed in freezing conditions. The chemistry wants time, warmth and cooperation, 3 things Winter considers character weaknesses that deserve punishment through structural failure. You learn to read mortar consistency by sight and feel, understanding that the mixture should flow like thick honey when warm, but set like stone when properly cured. Too thin and it won't hold, too thick and it won't spread, too cold and it won't cure, too rushed and it won't last. The rice component does something that pure lime mortar can't. It remains flexible when cured, allowing the joints to expand and contract with temperature changes without cracking. It's ancient engineering that understood thermodynamics centuries before anyone invented the terminology to describe why it works. But here's the winter reality that makes grown men weep. Even Miracle Mortar throws tantrums when exposed to temperatures that make metal contract and stone split. The chemistry slows down, the curing process extends, and quality control becomes a race between proper setting and water content, turning into ice crystals that explode the joints from within. Working with mortar in winter requires timing that would make Swiss clockmakers jealous, and patience that would impress Buddhist monks. You apply it quickly while it's still warm and workable, smooth it carefully to ensure proper bonding, then protect it from wind and frost while it sets, a process that can take days when the temperature refuses to cooperate. With construction schedules, the lime itself comes from quarries where workers heat limestone in kilns that produce temperatures hot enough to transform rock into powder while simultaneously creating working conditions that make Great Wall construction look like a vacation retreat for people with masochistic tendencies. You watch the lime preparation with the respect due to any process that involves convincing solid rock to become useful powder through the application of fire, chemistry and techniques that haven't changed significantly since ancient Rome figured out that heating limestone produces something useful for construction. Here's a historical fact that puts ancient manufacturing into perspective. Producing quality lime required maintaining kiln temperatures above 1000 degrees Celsius for days at a time, using nothing but wood fires and the kind of manual labour that makes modern factory workers appreciate automated systems with religious fervour. The workers who specialise in lime production have developed the kind of heat tolerance that suggests either supernatural endurance or complete resignation to working in conditions that resemble the antechamber to hell. They move around the kilns with practiced efficiency, tending fires that must never be allowed to die while maintaining temperatures that can turn limestone into lime or workers into cautionary tales about workplace safety. It's like running a steel mill using nothing but wood fires and human determination, where quality control consists of experienced workers who can judge temperature by the colour of flames and the sound of stones cracking in the heat. The finished lime arrives at construction sites as powder so caustic it can burn skin through gloves, mixed with water so carefully that the proportions are measured by workers who understand that getting the ratios wrong can result in mortar that's either too weak to hold stones or too strong to work with before it sets like concrete. You learn to handle lime with the respect due to any substance that can cause chemical burns while being essential for construction. Protective equipment consists of leather gloves, cloth wrappings for exposed skin, and the kind of situational awareness that comes from understanding that some materials don't forgive casual handling. The mixing process becomes a chemistry lesson taught by practical application and supervised by people who have learned the correct techniques through years of trial and error, with error being measured in mortar batches that had to be discarded, and occasionally fingers that had to be treated for chemical burns. Listen to the careful instructions. Add water slowly. Mix continuously. Don't let it sit or it'll set in the bowl. Don't add too much water or it won't cure properly. Don't work too fast or you'll make mistakes. Don't work too slow or it'll freeze. Quality control consists of experienced workers who can judge mortar consistency by sight, determining whether a batch will set properly or needs adjustment before it's applied to construction that must last longer than the dynasty that commissioned it. Here's what separates good mortar from structural failure waiting to happen. Proper hydration of the lime, complete incorporation of the rice components, correct water content for the ambient temperature, and application techniques that ensure proper bonding between mortar and stone. The cured mortar develops a strength that impresses modern engineers who analyse ancient construction and discover that the joints are often stronger than the stones they hold together. It's chemistry that works so well that buildings constructed with sticky rice mortar have survived earthquakes, floods, and centuries of weather that would destroy structures built with supposedly superior modern materials. But creating that miracle paste requires skills that take years to develop, materials that must be prepared with precision, and working conditions that make every batch a victory against chemistry that would prefer to happen in laboratory conditions rather than on frozen mountains, where everything goes wrong at the worst possible moment. Your first attempt at mortar application teaches you why experienced workers develop that particular expression of someone who's spent years arguing with physics and occasionally winning through sheer stubbornness, combined with proper technique. The tools themselves are simple. Wooden trowels for mixing and application, brushes made from animal hair for smoothing joints, scrapers for removing excess mortar before it sets, and an assortment of implements that suggest construction workers have always been masters of improvisation when proper equipment isn't available. Here's the reality of working with mortar in sub-zero temperatures. You have approximately 15 minutes between mixing and application where the chemistry cooperates with your construction schedule. After that, you're fighting a losing battle against physics that wants to turn your miracle paste into decorative lumps of frozen disappointment. The mortar must be kept warm during transport from mixing area to application site, which requires carrying containers that are wrapped in cloth, heated by hand warmers, and moved quickly enough to prevent freezing, but carefully enough to avoid spillage that wastes materials too precious to lose to clumsy handling. It's like trying to deliver ice cream in perfect condition during a blizzard, except instead of ice cream it's construction adhesive, instead of a blizzard it's weather that actively wants to kill you. And instead of disappointed customers you get structural failures that could collapse sections of wall onto whoever happens to be standing below. Application requires technique that combines the precision of surgery with the speed of someone being chased by deadline-motivated supervisors who measure progress in completed joints rather than worker comfort or safety considerations. You spread mortar with movements that must be smooth and continuous, working it into joints that need complete coverage without gaps that could allow water infiltration and freeze-thaw damage. Each stroke of the trowel must be deliberate, each smoothing motion calculated to create surfaces that will cure properly when protected from wind that wants to freeze the moisture before the chemical reactions can complete. Listen to the instructions delivered by workers who've mastered techniques that took years to develop. Spread evenly, fill all gaps, smooth the surface, work quickly but don't rush, don't let it freeze, don't let it dry too fast, don't make it too thick or too thin. The finished joints require protection from wind, frost and precipitation while they cure, a process that involves covering completed work with materials that insulate without preventing proper drying, creating microclimates around fresh mortar that allow chemistry to proceed at temperatures where most chemical reactions prefer to take a vacation. Quality control happens in real time, with experienced workers inspecting each joint for proper coverage, correct consistency, and signs that the curing process is proceeding normally, rather than failing in ways that will become apparent when the mortar crumbles during the next freeze-thaw cycle. Here's what separates successful construction from expensive rebuilding projects. Understanding that mortar chemistry doesn't negotiate with weather conditions, construction schedules, or imperial demands for faster progress. The reactions happen at their own pace, requiring protection and patience that must be provided regardless of other priorities. You develop an appreciation for workers who've mastered these techniques through years of experience that included failures, successes, and the kind of learning process that involves watching mortar joints crack because someone rushed the curing process or didn't protect fresh work from wind that froze it before the chemistry could establish proper bonds. The wall sections that survive centuries are testaments to workers who understood chemistry even without formal training, who developed techniques through practical application, and who took the time necessary to ensure that each joint would outlast the political systems that commissioned the construction. Standing back to examine completed work, you see joints that look simple, but represent the successful application of materials science, chemistry and construction techniques that required coordination between multiple specialists working under conditions that would challenge modern construction crews equipped with heated facilities and protective equipment. This is your introduction to the reality that building something permanent requires more than just stacking stones. It requires understanding materials at a level that allows you to make chemistry work even when every environmental factor is actively opposing your efforts to create something that will last longer than the civilization that built it. You stir embers that blink like tired accountants working late shifts in the Imperial Records Office. Each spark a data point for names that didn't make it home, and the more you stare, the more the numbers feel like snow, impossible to count while falling, obvious when it accumulates into drifts that block roads and bury evidence. Here's the historical fact nobody wants to own, and nobody wants to audit. There's no definitive, carefully maintained spreadsheet of deaths from wall construction across dynasties. Estimates range from tens of thousands to numbers that would make modern insurance companies file for bankruptcy and move to industries with better actuarial tables. Different dynasties kept books like they were planning to be audited by people who didn't exist yet, using accounting methods that treated human casualties as a line item, somewhere between tool maintenance and miscellaneous expenses that we'd rather not discuss in detail. You might not realise that popular numbers travel faster than accuracy because certainty sells better than scholarly uncertainty, and hundreds of thousands dead makes better headlines than we're honestly not sure, but it was probably really bad, and also the records are incomplete because record keepers sometimes became casualties themselves. It's like trying to calculate total deaths from working in dangerous conditions throughout history. You can ballpark it, but the specific data got filed under someone else's problem by administrators who had more pressing concerns, like not being next on the casualty list. The persistent tale about bodies sealed in the wall makes for great ghost stories, but scholars call engineering bullshit with the kind of professional certainty that comes from understanding structural requirements. Brick-built Ming sections would be weakened by human-shaped voids, and evidence suggests burial sites near construction zones rather than entombment inside the structure itself. It's basic physics combined with practical construction. Walls work because they're solid, not because they're impromptu mausoleums, but a methodical burial procedures conducted according to proper protocol doesn't have the same storytelling impact as built on bones. So guess which version survives in popular culture and tour guide presentations. Here's what we actually know from sources that bothered to keep records. Travel guides and frequently asked question scrolls often cite ranges like hundreds of thousands, sometimes extending to over 1 million, while carefully noting these are broad estimates compiled over centuries of discontinuous projects rather than a single campaign with a single, very depressing audit. The real question isn't how many died, but how do you compare different types of dying when the mountain didn't care about administrative categories? Scholars debate whether to count exposure deaths separately from construction accidents, separately from disease outbreaks, separately from raids, when the Ridge kept simpler books that only cared about outcomes, not causes of death. Listen to the silence where records should be. Imperial histories that treat casualties as necessary sacrifices, like breaking eggs for a very large, very national omelette that everyone had to eat whether they wanted it or not. Administrative documents that hint at heavy losses, using the same language weather reports use, to mention some precipitation during hurricanes. You might not realise that winter versus warfare isn't a competition. It's a duet where exposure, accidents, and illness grind away daily while arrows only sing occasionally, and both verses end up shorter in official files than they were on the mountainside where people actually died. It's like trying to compile comprehensive traffic statistics from the dawn of automobiles through today, except half the police departments never existed, the other half filed their reports in languages nobody speaks anymore, and the definition of traffic accident kept changing depending on who was asking and what they planned to do with the answer. The wall's route across knife-edge ridges multiplied full risks when parapets iced over and gloves stiffened to the point where grip strength became a survival skill that not everyone possessed. While reports of site-specific tower accidents rarely survive in detail, terrain and construction methods suggest a persistent background hum of workplace incidents that would make modern safety inspectors weep and immediately quit to become farmers. The bureaucratic reality reveals itself in documents that survived because they were stored properly, written on materials that didn't decompose, and considered important enough to preserve by people who understood that someone, someday, might want to know what actually happened during construction seasons that tested the limits of human endurance. Different dynasties had different reporting requirements, different motivations for accuracy, and different definitions of what constituted a casualty worth recording versus a statistic that could be absorbed into broader categories like construction expenses or natural workforce reduction. Here's what separates official histories from actual history. Official versions were written by people who didn't carry stones up frozen mountains, weren't present during the worst weather, and had career incentives to frame disasters as necessary sacrifices, rather than management failures that could have been prevented with better planning or more realistic scheduling. The Qin approach to record-keeping emphasized results over methods, treating the wall as a strategic objective that justified whatever costs were necessary to achieve completion. Documentation from this period tends to focus on military effectiveness rather than construction casualties, possibly because military historians considered combat deaths more worthy of detailed recording than workplace accidents. Ming Dynasty records show more systematic approaches to documentation, but also more administrative layers between actual construction sites and the offices where permanent records were maintained. Information had to travel through multiple bureaucratic levels, each with its own priorities and methods for summarizing data that might reflect poorly on supervisory competence. It's like trying to get accurate information about workplace safety from companies that have incentives to minimize reported incidents, except the companies are imperial bureaucracies, the workplace is a frozen mountain, and the reporting requirements were developed by people who'd never actually visited construction sites. Local records, when they survive, provide glimpses of ground-level reality that paint different pictures than imperial summaries. References to heavy losses during winter construction, requests for replacement workers that suggest higher attrition rates than planned, and administrative correspondence about supply problems that hint at conditions severe enough to impact workforce availability. Listen to what's not said in official documents. Euphemisms that disguise casualty rates, administrative language that transforms human costs into abstract policy discussions, and the kind of bureaucratic terminology that converts individual tragedies into statistical categories that can be managed through paperwork rather than addressed through improved working conditions. The surviving records show patterns that suggest systematic underreporting, construction schedules that required unrealistic workforce levels, supply allocations that didn't account for seasonal mortality, and administrative policies that treated worker replacement as routine maintenance rather than evidence of preventable casualties. Fringe fact: some regions show clusters of graves or memorial sites near wall construction zones. Folk archaeology that provides better documentation than official records. These burial grounds represent a different kind of bookkeeping, maintained by communities rather than bureaucracies, recording individual names rather than statistical summaries. Here's what modern conservation efforts reveal about historical construction. Damage patterns in existing wall sections that suggest construction techniques pushed beyond safe limits. Mortar analysis that shows evidence of rushed work during weather conditions that compromised quality. And structural evidence of repairs that became necessary because original construction occurred under conditions that prioritize speed over longevity. You might not realize that every repair becomes a conversation with unnamed dead. A way of saying your work still stands and so do we, even when winter pretends not to hear and keeps its own books in ice, stone, and the kind of silence that accumulates in places where too many people died too far from home. The wall itself serves as a ledger written in materials that record information differently than paper documents, preserving evidence in brick patterns, mortar composition, and construction techniques that reveal working conditions more accurately than administrative summaries that were filtered through bureaucratic priorities. Structural analysis of existing sections shows variations in construction quality that correlate with seasonal conditions, with winter-built sections displaying characteristics that suggest rushed work, compromised materials, or techniques modified to accommodate weather that didn't cooperate with construction schedules established by people who'd never personally experienced the working conditions they were mandating. Here's what materials science reveals about historical construction. Mortar analysis that shows evidence of freezing during curing processes, brick patterns that suggest workforce limitations during certain periods, and construction techniques that prioritize speed over quality in ways that would only make sense if worker availability was limited by factors not mentioned in official planning documents. Modern engineering analysis of wall sections identifies stress patterns and failure modes that provide indirect evidence of construction conditions. Areas where stones show evidence of impact damage from dropped loads, mortar joints that failed due to improper curing in cold conditions, and structural modifications that suggest original construction plans had to be adapted to accommodate workforce limitations. Listen to the stones themselves. Impact marks that tell stories about accidents that happened during construction, wear patterns that show where workers' hands gripped stone during placement, and tool marks that reveal the skill levels of people who worked under conditions that challenged even experienced craftsmen. The wall's construction shows evidence of learning curves that suggest high workforce turnover, with early sections of construction projects showing less refined techniques that improve over time, indicating that experienced workers were being replaced by people who had to learn skills while actually performing construction under conditions that made training difficult. Archaeological evidence from construction sites reveals working conditions through analysis of tool fragments, food remains, and shelter foundations that show how workers lived during construction seasons. These physical remains provide more reliable evidence about daily life than administrative documents that focused on project management rather than worker welfare. Fringe fact, some wall sections show evidence of reconstruction or repair work that happened immediately after original construction, suggesting that quality problems emerged quickly enough to require fixes during the same construction seasons when the original work was completed. Here's what conservation efforts teach us about historical construction. Preservation work on existing wall sections reveals construction shortcuts, material substitutions, and structural compromises that suggest working conditions weren't severe enough to impact the quality of construction that was intended to last for centuries. Modern structural analysis identifies areas where construction quality varies significantly within short distances, suggesting that working conditions change rapidly due to weather, workforce availability, or other factors that aren't mentioned in official project documentation, but are recorded in the physical evidence of how the work was actually completed. You run your fingers along ancient mortar joints and feel craftsmanship that represents successful completion of nearly impossible tasks under conditions that challenged every aspect of construction, from materials preparation to final installation. These joints survived because someone, somewhere, understood both chemistry and construction well enough to make them work despite everything. The wall stands as testimony to human persistence applied consistently across timescales longer than individual lifetimes, proving that determination can overcome conditions that initially seem impossible. But it also serves as a monument to costs that were paid by people whose names we don't know, whose individual contributions are recorded only in the accumulated success of construction that continues to demonstrate the effectiveness of their work centuries after their deaths. Numbers wobble, myths harden, but what endures is smaller math. One more joint set correctly, one more stone placed properly, one more day of work completed safely enough that someone lived to continue construction the next day. The wall remembers work more clearly than workers, competence more clearly than casualties, but both are preserved in construction that outlasted the political systems that commissioned it. You wake to the sound of someone trying to convince fire to stay interested in wood, while the wind argues back with the persistence of a customer service complaint that's been escalated to management, reviewed by committee, returned marked insufficient suffering, and forwarded to the department of making everything worse. The cold doesn't just wake you up, it conducts a comprehensive performance review of every joint, muscle and extremity, filing detailed reports on which parts of your body are still functional, which are filed for early retirement during the night, and which are currently on strike pending improved working conditions. Your breath forms clouds thick enough to provide actual concealment from supervisors, which would be useful if you had anywhere to hide on a ridge that offers all the privacy of a dinner plate balanced on a flagpole and photographed from multiple angles by weather systems that specialize in exposure documentation. Here's a historical fact. That'll ruin your camping fantasies forever. High mountain passes in deep winter require melting snow for water, adding time and fuel cost to every basic task that modern people accomplish by turning handles or pressing buttons. Even medieval travel accounts note how wind and dryness turn finding and keeping liquid water into a full-time job that doesn't pay overtime or offer advancement opportunities. The mess tent serves something that's technically porridge, though it requires a generous interpretation of both porridge and food, and possibly a complete redefinition of digestible that extends the concept to include substances that were never intended for human consumption but happen to contain calories. It tastes like boiled sadness with hints of whatever the cook could scrape from the bottom of storage containers that have seen better dynasties, seasoned with the kind of desperation that makes tree bark seem like a reasonable menu addition. It's like trying to run a restaurant where the kitchen is outside, the ingredients freeze overnight, the customers are rocks that need to be carried uphill before service. The health inspector is hypothermia, and Gordon Ramsay would have a complete psychological breakdown and apply for jobs in warmer, saner industries that don't require questioning the fundamental nature of food as a concept. You wrap your hands around a bowl that provides roughly the same amount of warmth as holding a moderately enthusiastic ice cube, while the porridge itself has the consistency of liquid disappointment and the flavour profile of "we tried, but physics disagreed with our menu plans and won the argument decisively." Still, you eat it because calories are currency here, and you're about to spend your body weight in energy-hauling building materials upgrades that would make roller coaster designers reconsider their career choices and apply for jobs in industries that don't require defying gravity on a daily basis. Listen to the morning sounds that serve as nature's alarm clock for people who didn't request wake-up service. Metal tools ringing against stone in rhythms that suggest either construction progress or someone having an argument with geology, the scrape of shovels against ground that's frozen solid enough to chip tools, and the soft cursing of men who've discovered that leather gloves become rigid at temperatures where human flesh starts making poor life decisions. The sun makes a token appearance, painting everything gold in that particular light that makes even frozen misery look picturesque from a safe distance. It's nature's Instagram filter applied to historical suffering, designed to make observers forget that the subjects of this beautiful photography are slowly dying of exposure while creating tourist attractions for people who will visit centuries later with proper winter clothing and heated transportation. Your first lesson in Great Wall construction logistics reveals itself through the harsh reality that everything requiring accomplishment needs fire, water, or both. And both fire and water have developed strong opinions about cooperating in temperatures that make ice cubes feel overdressed for the weather conditions. Fire requires fuel that must be gathered, transported, and maintained by people whose job descriptions already include carry impossible weights up impossible grades, adding fuel collection to daily responsibilities that were already pushing the limits of human endurance and available daylight hours. Wood gathering means venturing away from construction sites into the terrain that offers all the hospitality of a frozen wasteland, designed by someone who confused challenging with potentially lethal, and decided to err on the side of maximum difficulty for anyone trying to accomplish basic survival tasks. Here's the fuel economy reality. Every piece of wood burned for warmth is wood not available for construction projects that require timber for scaffolding, tool handles, and structural components. Every calorie spent gathering fuel is energy not available for construction work that's already demanding more physical output than most human bodies can sustain indefinitely. Water presents its own mathematical challenges that would make modern logistics coordinators weep and immediately apply for jobs that don't require solving physics problems with hand tools and determination. Snow must be melted using fuel that's already in short supply, requiring time that's already in shorter supply, producing water that freezes again if not used immediately for purposes that are already behind schedule. It's like trying to run a manufacturing operation where the raw materials fight back. The power supply requires constant manual intervention. The working conditions violate every safety regulation that will be invented over the next several centuries, and the quality control department consists of weather systems that grade on a curve ending in death. The daily calorie mathematics become survival equations that determine who continues working tomorrow and who becomes another entry in casualty reports that may or may not be maintained with accuracy sufficient to reflect actual human costs of construction projects that prioritise completion over worker welfare. Food supplies calculated for normal working conditions prove inadequate when combined with extreme cold that increases caloric requirements, physical labour that demands energy expenditure beyond normal human limits, and working conditions that burn calories faster than supply systems can replace them through logistics networks that weren't designed for these conditions. Listen to the conversations that happen around cooking fires when supervisors are elsewhere, discussions about rationing strategies that extend available food supplies, techniques for maximising caloric extraction from ingredients that weren't intended for human consumption, and the kind of meal or planning that transforms survival into a daily mathematical challenge solved through creativity and desperation. You learn to measure progress in terms of energy conservation rather than construction advancement, understanding that every unnecessary movement, every inefficient technique, every wasted calorie reduces your probability of surviving long enough to see spring weather that will make this construction season seem like a bad dream rather than current reality. The work itself becomes a careful balance between accomplishing enough construction progress to satisfy supervisors who measure success in completed sections rather than worker survival, and conserving enough energy to maintain body temperature, immune system function, and the basic physical capabilities necessary to continue working under conditions that challenge every aspect of human physiology. Supply logistics for Great Wall construction reveal themselves as masterpieces of administrative optimism combined with practical impossibility, designed by people who understood strategic objectives but had never personally carried supplies up frozen mountains during weather conditions that make pack animals refuse to work. Every tool, every piece of hardware, every construction supply must travel from manufacturing centres to construction sites through transportation networks that consist primarily of human carriers walking up terrain that challenges mountain goats with excellent health insurance and professional climbing experience. Here's the supply chain reality that makes modern logistics look simple. Replacement tools must be manufactured, transported, and distributed to construction sites where tools break daily due to working conditions that exceed design specifications used by workers whose survival depends on maintaining equipment that wasn't designed for the conditions where it's being used. Iron tools require fuel for manufacturing, transportation capacity that's already overwhelmed by food and construction material requirements, and replacement schedules that must account for breakage rates higher than anyone planned when calculating initial supply requirements for construction projects that were already pushing the limits of available resources. It's like trying to maintain manufacturing equipment in an environment where every component is constantly pushed beyond design limits. Replacement parts must be manufactured on site using primitive methods, and equipment failure means project delays that can result in people dying of exposure while waiting for repairs. Rope technology becomes critically important when every construction technique depends on cordage that must support loads heavier than the rope was designed to handle, used by workers whose lives depend on equipment reliability that can't be guaranteed under conditions that weren't considered during manufacturing processes. Quality control for supplies happens at construction sites rather than manufacturing facilities conducted by workers who must identify defective equipment while using it for tasks that don't permit testing under safe conditions. Equipment failure during use means immediate danger rather than inconvenience, making supply quality a life or death issue rather than an administrative concern. Listen to the sounds of equipment maintenance performed by people who understand that tool failure during critical construction tasks can result in accidents that affect entire work crews. The ring of metal being sharpened on stones, the scrape of wood being smoothed and reinforced, and the careful testing of rope and hardware that must perform reliably under conditions that challenge every aspect of materials engineering. You learn to maintain equipment with the kind of attention to detail that comes from understanding that mechanical failure at the wrong moment can transform routine construction work into survival situations that test every aspect of your preparation and training for conditions that weren't covered in any job orientation program. The supply situation becomes a daily lesson in conservation, improvisation, and the kind of resource management that emerges when everything is scarce. Nothing is replaceable on short notice, and waste means someone else doesn't have access to materials that might determine whether they survive the construction season. Food preservation techniques developed by people who understand that spoilage means hunger. Hunger means reduced physical capability, and reduced physical capability means increased accident risk during construction work that's already dangerous enough when performed by workers operating at full physical capacity. storage methods that protect supplies from weather conditions that can destroy materials faster than they can be replaced, using techniques that weren't described in supply manuals because the people who wrote supply manuals had never worked under conditions where proper storage meant the difference between project success and catastrophic failure. The entire logistics system operates on margins so thin that any disruption, weather delays, transportation accidents, equipment failures, can cascade into supply shortages that affect every aspect of construction work and worker survival during seasons when there are no alternative sources for critical materials and equipment. You develop appreciation for workers who've mastered supply management under impossible conditions, who've learned to make materials last longer than design specifications suggest, and who've developed techniques for accomplishing construction tasks using whatever happens to be available rather than what would be ideal for the work being performed. You stand on a watchtower that feels like the Earth's knuckle raised in defiance, while air presses its case against your continued existence with the persistence of a lawyer who took personal offence at your survival and decided to make it a career-ending professional challenge that doesn't accept appeals or plea bargains. Here's the strategic irony that military planners didn't anticipate when they drew up construction schedules on paper that never got cold. The wall's purpose was defending against human enemies from the steppe, but locally, during construction seasons, winter killed more consistently than raiders, because not every threat carries banners, announces its intentions, or waits politely for convenient battle schedules that accommodate meal breaks. You might not realise that raids make stories because they have beginnings, middles, and ends that can be written into reports that make sense to people reading them centuries later. But cold makes statistics that accumulate gradually, kill quietly, and don't provide the kind of dramatic narrative structure that historians prefer when writing accounts of military effectiveness. It's like installing the world's most sophisticated security system to protect against burglars while leaving all the windows open during a blizzard, then wondering why the threat you prepared for killed fewer people than the threat you can't negotiate with, arrest or defeat through superior tactics and better training. Scholars debate categorization methods for casualty reporting because surviving records treat war deaths and work attrition like completely different budget items, filed under separate administrative categories, when the Mountain kept simpler books that only cared about outcomes rather than causes of death that could be sorted into bureaucratically convenient categories. Even when the wall functioned as intended, signalling approaching threats, coordinating defensive responses, providing strategic advantages that justified construction costs, winter routines looked exactly like siege conditions imposed by weather systems that didn't care about military strategies, political objectives, or imperial proclamations about defensive effectiveness. The positioning strategy that put towers on high points increased visibility and tactical advantages while magnifying wind speeds, creating working conditions that made every parapet a theatre, where winter rehearsed arguments it always won when given sufficient time and patience to demonstrate its superior commitment to the conflict. Listen to the wind that serves as the Mountain's daily briefing on weather conditions that don't distinguish between strategic positions and random rocks, defensive installations and accidental targets, imperial construction projects and natural features that happen to be located at elevations where weather systems practice their most effective intimidation techniques. Here's the occupational hazard. Nobody included in military planning documents. The most terrifying enemy turned out to be the one you inhaled with every breath. Cold that settled in your chest like an occupying force and asked you to sign a very small contract with a very large print buried in terms and conditions that nobody reads until it's too late to negotiate better terms. Some stretches of wall remember quiet seasons more clearly than violent ones, where no raids materialized, no enemies appeared, no battles were fought, yet spring censuses still read shorter because wind kept more reliable schedules than human threats and maintained better long-term strategic consistency than enemy forces that operated according to seasonal patterns and political considerations. Defense preparations designed to counter human threats often made weather vulnerabilities worse, in ways that weren't apparent until conditions became severe enough to demonstrate the practical consequences of strategic decisions that prioritize military effectiveness over environmental survivability. Clear sight lines that provided excellent visibility for spotting approaching enemies also meant exposure to wind patterns that turned watchtowers into wind tunnels, creating working conditions that challenged the physical endurance of people whose job performance directly affected defensive capabilities during combat situations that required peak alertness and physical functionality. High positions that offered tactical advantages for defensive operations also meant longer supply routes, increased transportation costs, and logistical challenges that became critical vulnerabilities when weather conditions made routine supply deliveries into survival expeditions that risked losing more resources than they delivered to construction sites. Here's the strategic planning oversight that becomes obvious only during implementation. Defense manuals focused on countering human enemies who used tactics, followed patterns, and made decisions based on rational military considerations, while weather systems operated according to physics that didn't care about human strategic objectives, political considerations, or military necessity. It's like having excellent cybersecurity against hackers, while your server room slowly floods from a leaky pipe nobody noticed, because everyone was watching network monitors instead of checking for environmental threats that could disable systems more effectively than any deliberate attack. The horizon watches without blinking while you count towers disappearing into weather conditions that reduce visibility to distances measured in arm lengths rather than strategic miles, making watchtowers ineffective for their primary purpose while continuing to expose defenders to environmental conditions that impair their ability to perform any military functions. Distance becomes academic when visibility drops, and every watchtower becomes an isolated universe of a few dozen people trying to keep each other alive until morning, while defensive coordination becomes impossible, and strategic communication reduces to hoping that signal fires can be seen through weather conditions that obscure landmarks, obliterate sightlines, and turn navigation into guesswork. Here's what defense manuals didn't cover because the people who wrote them worked in heated offices. How to maintain fighting readiness when your primary battle is against your own body temperature. How to stay alert for enemy signals when your main concern is keeping fingers flexible enough to operate signal equipment that becomes unreliable in cold conditions. The wall's defensive value remained real and strategically important, but its construction costs were paid in a currency that military budgets don't typically itemize. The slow accumulation of small failures that compound over time until someone stops showing up for morning assignments, and defensive effectiveness decreases due to personnel shortages that weren't caused by the enemy action. Fringe fact: some sections of wall show evidence of modifications made during construction to address weather-related problems that weren't anticipated during the initial planning phases, suggesting that defensive installations had to be adapted to accommodate environmental threats that proved more persistent than human enemies. Listen to the silence that accumulates in places where strategic objectives met environmental reality, and discovered that physics doesn't negotiate, weather doesn't compromise, and defensive positions must be manned by people who can survive the conditions that make those positions strategically valuable in the first place. The most successful enemy turned out to be the one that never declared war, never showed up on intelligence reports, never sent ambassadors to negotiate terms, and never offered surrender conditions that could be accepted or rejected based on strategic considerations that made sense to military planners working with incomplete information about actual battlefield conditions. It maintained steady pressure without requiring supply lines, reinforcements, or seasonal campaigning schedules, operating according to principles that remained consistent regardless of political changes, military strategies, or imperial proclamations about defensive effectiveness and construction progress that measured success in completed sections rather than sustainable operations. Here's the tactical reality that becomes clear only through practical experience. The enemy that kills through persistent low-level attrition rather than dramatic battles doesn't generate the kind of historical records that document defeat, victory, or strategic effectiveness, leaving military historians to analyze incomplete data about conflicts that weren't recognized as conflicts at the time they were happening. Environmental warfare operates according to rules that don't distinguish between military targets and civilian populations, strategic installations and random construction projects, important officials and expendable workers, making it impossible to develop defensive strategies that protect some people while sacrificing others according to military priorities that assume enemies will cooperate with strategic planning by focusing their attacks on appropriate targets. It's like fighting an enemy that doesn't have headquarters to attack, supply lines to cut, communication networks to disrupt, or political objectives that can be addressed through negotiation, diplomacy, or superior military force applied, according to principles that assume conflicts have solutions that can be achieved through strategic thinking and tactical superiority. The wall stands as testimony to strategic success achieved through construction techniques that worked despite environmental conditions that opposed every aspect of the project, proving that human determination can overcome challenges that initially seem impossible when applied consistently over time, scales longer than individual lifetimes or political administrations. But it also serves as a monument to costs that were paid by people whose individual contributions are recorded only in the accumulated success of construction that continues to demonstrate the effectiveness of their work centuries after their deaths, while the specific details of their struggles against environmental conditions are preserved only in the physical evidence of construction techniques that had to be adapted to accommodate realities that weren't mentioned in planning documents. You look out over terrain that stretches beyond the horizon, understanding that every section of wall represents successful completion of construction tasks that challenged every aspect of human capability, proving that impossible projects can be completed through techniques that transform individual limitations into collective capability that exceeds what any individual could accomplish working alone. The wind continues its argument with human ambition, making the same points it's been making for centuries about the relationship between human construction projects and environmental systems that operate according to principles that don't care about human objectives, political considerations, or strategic necessity. But the wall continues to stand, proving that some arguments can be won through persistence rather than superior logical presentation. Tomorrow will bring more construction, more challenges, and more opportunities to demonstrate that human stubbornness can be a force of nature that relocates geological features through the application of sufficient determination, proper techniques, and really good rope technology applied by people who refuse to let physics have the final word in discussions about what's possible. You navigate steps that have obviously been taking notes on how to efficiently convert confident footsteps into unscheduled aerial demonstrations, studying advanced techniques in biomechanics with specialization in human flight patterns that don't end well for the humans involved. The frost at each corner has evolved from weather phenomenon into active policy, accumulating with the dedication of a tax collector who found religion and decided that collecting ice deposits was his divine calling, requiring payment in the form of human dignity and occasionally consciousness. Here's the architectural reality that becomes clear through painful experience. The wall follows ridgelines through thousands of towers and passes engineered into terrain that was deliberately chosen to be difficult, where builders stacked complications on purpose, trading convenience for strategic advantage in a deal that seemed reasonable, until you had to live with the consequences on a daily basis. You might not realize that steep stone steps with a light dusting of powder are more dangerous than obvious ice because they request trust they have no intention of honoring, like a contract written in invisible ink that becomes visible only after you've committed to agreements that weren't fully explained during the negotiation process. It's like a staircase designed by someone who confused challenging with potentially lethal, where every step is a pop quiz on physics administered by gravity, using a grading curve that's determined by how far you fall and how many bones break during the educational experience. The mixture of brick, stone, and rammed earth across different wall sections creates a patchwork of maintenance challenges and hazard profiles that would make modern safety inspectors weep and immediately apply for jobs in industries that don't require risk assessment, of construction projects that were built by people who considered dangerous to be a design feature rather than a problem requiring solution. Earthen faces particularly hate freeze-thaw cycles with the intensity of someone who took weather patterns personally and decided to express their displeasure through structural failure that happens gradually until it happens suddenly, usually when people are standing on the structures that are failing. During active construction, surfaces get disturbed repeatedly, which prevents protective biological crusts from forming and leaves freeze-thaw cycles with an open invitation to host their own demolition parties all winter long, with guest lists that include every water molecule that can find a crack to expand inside. Listen to the sounds that serve as nature's quality control inspections, the subtle crack of stone adjusting to temperature changes, the whisper of mortar expanding and contracting in joints that were designed to last centuries but weren't specifically designed to accommodate the kind of thermal stress that happens during construction seasons when everything freezes and thaws on daily cycles. Some towers maintain their own microclimates, wind eddies that ice one step while leaving the next mysteriously dry, like the mountain is conducting controlled experiments on human balance and taking careful notes on the results for publication in journals that won't be invented for several centuries. Here's the maintenance nightmare that nobody mentioned during project planning. Site-specific casualty logs rarely survive because record-keeping during people keep falling off at things periods wasn't prioritised by administrators who had bigger concerns, like not being next on the assignment list for positions that required personal inspection of construction sites where people kept falling off things. You might not realise that most disasters begin 2 steps before the one that fails, in tiny decisions that accumulate like snow until weight becomes physics, physics becomes momentum, and momentum becomes a learning experience that's educational for observers, but less pleasant for participants in the educational demonstration. Different materials respond to winter stress, like members of a dysfunctional family at holiday dinner, each with their own coping mechanisms, personal issues, and ways of expressing dissatisfaction that affect everyone else's ability to function normally during seasonal gatherings that nobody really wants to attend but can't avoid. Bricks resist temperature changes, but develop stress fractures under repeated thermal cycling, like people who handle pressure well until they don't, expressing accumulated stress through failure patterns that start small and grow until they become structural problems that can't be ignored or fixed with simple repairs. Stone cleaves along weak planes when exposed to conditions that exceed its tolerance for thermal expansion and contraction, demonstrating that even geological materials have limits that can be exceeded through persistent application of environmental stress that doesn't care about structural integrity or construction schedules. Rammed earth simply sheds layers like depression made architectural, giving up on the whole concept of structural integrity and settling for gradual dissolution that continues until someone intervenes with maintenance techniques that address the underlying causes rather than just the symptoms of structural failure. Here's the material science reality that makes construction engineering complicated. Even miracle mortars have their limits that can't be overcome through superior composition, perfect application techniques, or wishful thinking that treats chemistry like it's subject to negotiation rather than physical laws that don't care about construction deadlines or imperial objectives. Perfect sticky rice-lime mortar composition can't overcome rushed curing schedules, inadequate protection during setting, or the simple reality that limestone doesn't negotiate with thermodynamics and won't cooperate with construction schedules that treat chemical reactions like administrative processes that can be accelerated through management pressure. It's like trying to maintain electronics where some components hate cold, others hate moisture, all of them hate temperature changes, and they're all forced to work together in conditions that violate every manufacturer recommendation simultaneously while warranty service consists of hope and improvised repairs using whatever materials happen to be available. Conservation science reveals that biological crusts can act like living varnish on exposed earthen surfaces, but only after construction disturbance ends and ecological succession gets time to establish protective biofilms through natural processes that require years rather than construction seasons to develop effective protection. It's nature's warranty program with activation periods measured in decades rather than months, providing excellent long-term protection for structures that survive long enough to benefit from biological systems that weren't available during its original construction phases, when protection had to be provided through techniques that worked immediately rather than eventually. The wall keeps detailed records written in chip patterns, spall marks and crack networks, a library of seasonal stress that tells more accurate stories about construction conditions than most surviving administrative documents that focused on project management rather than the practical realities of working with materials under conditions that challenged every aspect of construction technology. Each brick size variation, each mortar seam color change, each modification in construction technique serves as documentation of which winters were pushed too hard, which construction seasons had adequate resources, and which foremen understood that corpses don't lay bricks efficiently regardless of how urgent construction schedules become. Here's what materials remember that paperwork forgets. Every impact from drop tools, every stresses pattern from overloaded sections, every modification made to accommodate working conditions that weren't anticipated during planning phases, every repair that became necessary because original construction was completed under conditions that prioritized speed over long-term structural integrity. Modern conservation efforts face the same basic challenges as original construction. How to protect mixed materials from weather systems that don't care about historical significance, cultural value, tourism revenue, or the amount of work that went into creating structures that were intended to last longer than the political systems that commissioned them. Earthquakes, storms, mudslides, and casual human damage all write their signatures in material failure patterns that persist so longer than the civilizations that caused them, creating archaeological records that document both human achievement and the environmental challenges that had to be overcome to achieve construction success under impossible conditions. You might not realize that myths outlive facts because legends don't require maintenance budgets, skilled craftsmen, or materials that must be quarried, transported, and installed by people working under conditions that challenge every aspect of human physical capability and construction technology, visible from space and filled with bodies persisted despite astronauts saying no and engineers explaining why these claims don't make physical sense. Because mystery sells better than mortar chemistry, and ghost stories are more entertaining than accurate information about construction techniques that actually worked. The strongest stories are often the most boring ones. Maintenance schedules that kept structures functional, repair protocols that addressed problems before they became disasters, and the gradual accumulation of competence that allows ancient chemistry to age gracefully, despite everything that weather systems, human negligence, and time itself can do to accelerate decay processes. Materials remember pain, but also craft through physical evidence that demonstrates both the challenges faced during construction and the solutions developed by people who understood both chemistry and construction well enough to make techniques work despite environmental conditions that opposed every aspect of the building process. Well-executed joints and carefully protected surfaces weather both gossip and actual weather with equal dignity, proving that good technique becomes its own form of immortality that preserves not just structures, but evidence of human capability applied under conditions that initially seemed impossible to survive, much less successfully navigate while completing construction projects that exceeded anything previously attempted. You run your fingers along mortar joints that survived centuries because someone, somewhere, understood materials science well enough to make chemistry work despite weather conditions that challenged every assumption about what was possible, proving that human knowledge can overcome environmental challenges when applied with sufficient skill, patience, and determination to get the technical details right even when everything else goes wrong. You walk the ridge at an hour when Sky hasn't decided which day it wants to claim ownership of, and the wall feels less like a line of defense and more like a sentence that's been running for centuries without finding appropriate punctuation, written in a language that consists entirely of stone, mortar, and human determination. Here's the historical accounting that matters more than casualty statistics. The most famous stretches are Ming-era brick and stone with sticky rice mortar. Yet, the Great Wall is actually multiple projects spanning dynasties, materials, and motivations. A palimpsest of strategies that survived not because winter was merciful, but because people became methodical about techniques that worked. You might not realize that what endures isn't certainty about numbers, construction methods, or historical details, but practice, repair schedules maintained across centuries, maintenance protocols that adapted to changing conditions, and the stubborn human refusal to let weather finish sentences that took generations to write in materials that were intended to outlast the war. Political systems that commissioned them. Modern myths keep pace with ancient ones in the kinds of stories people tell about construction projects that exceed normal human scale. Tales of orbital visibility and entombed workers persist alongside new legends about construction techniques and casualty figures, all sharing the same basic appeal. Definitive answers to questions that don't actually have definitive answers because the evidence is incomplete, and the scale exceeds normal human comprehension. The truth about Great Wall construction is simultaneously more boring and more impressive than the myths that surround it. Boring because it involves chemistry, logistics, bureaucracy, and the kind of technical details that don't make good stories for people who want simple explanations for complicated achievements. Impressive because chemistry, logistics, and bureaucracy actually built something that outlasted the empire that commissioned it. Here's what contemporary conservation reveals about ancient construction. Current threats include natural erosion that continues the same processes that challenged original builders, human encroachment that creates new problems, tourism damage that affects structures in ways not anticipated by people who built them for defense rather than visitation, and time's systematic conversion of organized matter into geological randomness. Protection requires the same basic approach as original construction. Consistent effort applied over time scales longer than individual careers. Appropriate materials that must be sourced and prepared according to techniques that actually work. and realistic expectations about what's possible given available resources and environmental conditions that haven't changed significantly since original construction. The question of whether winter killed more workers than warfare can't be settled with a single number because it's not actually a numerical question that can be answered through better research or more complete records. It's a shape traced by terrain, policy, season, and human physiology, an argument the Ridge continues making with ice and wind while archives respond with silence and educated guesses. It's like asking whether more people die from car accidents or heart disease. The answer depends on which populations you're measuring, how you define categories, what time period you're examining, and what you plan to do with the information once you have it, assuming you can get information that's accurate enough to be useful for policy decisions. You might not realise that uncertainty isn't failure of historical method or evidence of inadequate research. It's honesty about the limits of evidence that survive from construction projects that prioritise completion over documentation, conducted under conditions that made record-keeping a secondary concern compared to basic survival. What matters isn't the precise body count that can never be determined with accuracy, sufficient to satisfy modern statistical standards, but the acknowledgement that construction costs were paid in a currency that administrative budgets don't typically itemise, human endurance applied under conditions that challenged every aspect of physical capability and technical knowledge. The wall's greatest achievement isn't military effectiveness, strategic impact, or architectural innovation. It's organisational. Coordinating materials, labour, logistics, and engineering across centuries of discontinuous construction represents one of history's most successful long-term infrastructure projects, even accounting for human costs that were higher than anyone planned and environmental challenges that exceeded every estimate. Here's the survival calculation that actually matters for understanding historical achievement. Enough people learned enough techniques well enough to create something that outlasts the political systems that built it, the military threats that justified it, and the administrative structures that managed it. That's not just construction, it's cultural transmission through mineral substrate, knowledge preservation in physical form, and proof that human persistence can create permanent changes in landscape when applied consistently across timescales longer than individual lifetimes or political administrations. Fringe fact, modern visitors often comment on the wall's timeless quality, but it's more accurate to say it's timeful, visibly layered with different eras, techniques, and materials, each representing solutions to similar problems worked out by different people under different constraints, creating a physical record of human adaptation to environmental challenges. The wall today serves as monument, tourist destination, national symbol, or an archaeological site simultaneously, demonstrating that infrastructure projects can acquire meanings and functions that weren't anticipated during original construction phases, but develop through historical processes that transform utilitarian structures into cultural symbols. Conservation efforts face the same basic challenge as original construction: how to protect mixed materials from environmental stress, using available technology, limited budgets, and organisational structures that may or may not survive long enough to complete projects that require decades rather than construction seasons to show results. What would you build first at a frozen mountain pass? Shelter walls that provide immediate protection from environmental conditions, safer stairs that reduce accident risks during daily operations, or furnaces for perfect mortar cures that ensure long-term structural integrity? The question remains relevant because the problems remain relevant. How to accomplish large objectives under difficult conditions using imperfect resources and finite time. The choice reveals priorities that define not just construction projects, but civilizations: immediate survival versus long-term effectiveness, individual safety versus collective achievement, technical perfection versus practical completion within available resources, and time constraints that can't be negotiated with environmental systems that don't care about human schedules. Here's what makes the question interesting rather than academic. Every construction project faces similar trade-offs between competing priorities that can't all be optimized simultaneously, requiring decisions that reflect values, available resources, technical capabilities, and environmental constraints that limit what's possible regardless of what's desired. The wall's lesson isn't about military engineering, imperial ambition, or construction techniques that were impressive for their time period. It's about the accumulated power of human persistence applied consistently across timescales longer than individual lifetimes, proving that determination can create permanent changes in physical environment when supported by technical knowledge and organisational systems that maintain continuity despite political changes. That's a technology that doesn't require polskich dating because it's based on principles that remain constant: consistent effort, appropriate techniques, realistic expectations about what's possible, and the kind of long-term thinking that treats immediate difficulties as temporary obstacles rather than permanent limitations on what can be achieved. It's like maintaining a website that started in the 90s, runs on multiple legacy systems, serves millions of users, and absolutely cannot go offline because it's too historically important. Except the server is made of rocks, the cooling system is "hope winter isn't too bad this year," and the technical support team consists of people who learned programming by building the system rather than reading manuals that didn't exist. You might not realise that every ancient mega project was built by people who thought they were just doing their jobs, solving immediate problems with available tools, meeting construction schedules that seemed impossible until they were completed through techniques that worked despite theoretical objections about feasibility. Nobody woke up thinking, "Today I will create a wonder of the world that will be visible from space." Which it isn't, but the myth persists because it's more interesting than accurate information about construction achievements that were impressive without requiring exaggeration to make them seem worthwhile. They woke up thinking, "Today I will not fall off this ridge while carrying stones that weigh more than I do, up slopes that appear to have been designed by someone who confused challenging with potentially lethal and decided that construction workers needed more excitement in their professional lives." The wall's greatest achievement isn't that it kept enemies out. Historical evidence suggests its military effectiveness was mixed and varied with political conditions. That changed over time. Is that it kept people employed across multiple dynasty changes, political upheavals, economic crises, and environmental challenges that would have ended less ambitious projects. It's the world's longest public works project, demonstrating that large-scale construction can provide economic benefits, develop technical capabilities, and create infrastructure that serves multiple purposes even when original justifications become obsolete due to changing political and military conditions. And like most public works projects throughout history, it was always over budget, behind schedule, and subject to cost overruns that weren't anticipated during planning phases when administrators made optimistic assumptions about construction costs, worker productivity, and environmental conditions that proved more challenging than expected. Here's the final accounting that historians can agree on. Numbers matter less than acknowledgement. Whether winter construction killed thousands or hundreds of thousands is less important than recognising that costs were paid by people whose names we don't know, whose individual contributions are recorded only in construction that continues to demonstrate the effectiveness of their work centuries after their deaths. What survives is work rather than workers, technique rather than individuals, and proof that human competence can create permanent achievements when applied consistently over time. Scales that exceed individual lifetimes but operate within the limits of human physical capability and technical knowledge available during historical periods that didn't have access to modern technology. The wall stands because thousands of people mixed mortar correctly, laid bricks carefully, maintained structures consistently, and developed techniques that worked despite environmental conditions that challenged every assumption about what was possible using available materials and construction methods. The empire that built it is gone, collapsed due to political changes that had nothing to do with construction quality or defensive effectiveness. But the infrastructure remains because competence outlasts politics, technical knowledge survives political changes, and good workmanship creates its own form of immortality that preserves evidence of human capability long after the political systems that commissioned construction projects have become historical footnotes. Epilogue. The long view. You stand where the wall disappears into morning mist, and it occurs to you that visibility, the whole point of building on ridgelines, becomes irrelevant when weather decides to redraw maps, obscure landmarks, and demonstrate that environmental conditions don't respect human strategic objectives or construction schedules. The sun finally makes an appearance, painting everything gold in that particular light that makes even frozen misery look picturesque from a distance safe enough to appreciate beauty without experiencing the conditions that create it. It's Instagram filter physics applied to historical suffering, making observers forget the practical realities of construction work performed under conditions that challenged every aspect of human endurance. Here's what you've learned through direct experience rather than academic study. Building the Great Wall in winter didn't kill more people than wars because winter and warfare weren't competing for casualty statistics. They were collaborating in ways that administrative categories couldn't capture accurately. Exposure, exhaustion, and accidents wrote casualty figures in a language that bureaucratic records couldn't translate into the kind of statistical summaries that satisfy modern historical research methods that require quantitative data about qualitative experiences that can't be reduced to numbers without losing essential information about what actually happened. The wall succeeded not because it was perfectly planned, efficiently executed, or completed according to original schedules that proved overly optimistic about construction conditions, but because it was persistently maintained by generation after generation of people who showed up, assessed damage, made repairs, and passed responsibility to the next shift in a relay race measured in centuries rather than construction seasons. It's like maintaining a computer network that started with vacuum tubes, expanded through multiple technology generations, serves millions of users who depend on continuous service, and absolutely cannot be shut down for upgrades because it's too historically important to interrupt. Except the computers are made of stone, and the power supply consists of people who understand that system maintenance is more important than individual convenience. You might not realize that every ancient megaproject was built by people who thought they were just completing assigned tasks, rather than creating historical monuments that would be studied, admired, and visited by people from cultures that didn't exist when the construction work was being performed under conditions that modern people can barely imagine. The wall's greatest achievement isn't engineering innovation, military effectiveness, or architectural beauty. It's proof that human persistence, applied consistently across timescales longer than individual lifetimes, can create changes in physical environment that outlast the political systems that commissioned them, the military threats that justified them, and the administrative structures that managed them. What survives is work rather than documentation, competence rather than planning, and evidence that determination can overcome conditions that initially seem impossible when supported by technical knowledge that develops through practical application rather than theoretical advancing. So like and subscribe if this rhythm of history helped you understand something about human capability that statistics and textbook summaries can't capture, and drop your location and local time in the comments so we can all appreciate being warm inside and not carrying bricks up frozen mountains at whatever hour you're experiencing while listening to stories about people who did exactly that and created something that still stands as proof of what's possible. The wall teaches us that human persistence, when applied consistently across timescales longer than individual careers or political administrations, can create things that outlast the motivations that created them, the challenges that threatened them, and the administrative systems that manage them. That's not just construction. It's culture converted into stone, knowledge preserved in physical form, and proof that some human achievements transcend the historical periods that produced them by demonstrating capabilities that remain impressive, regardless of technological advances that make the original construction methods seem primitive by comparison. Sweet dreams, and remember, tomorrow's problems are tomorrow's problems that will be solved by tomorrow's people using tomorrow's resources. Tonight, you're warm, safe, and not building infrastructure in sub-zero temperatures while questioning every life choice that led to carrying rocks up mountains during weather that makes survival a daily achievement worth celebrating. That's what counts as winning in any historical period. Surviving long enough to pass knowledge, techniques, and determination to people who will continue work that exceeds what any individual can accomplish but becomes possible through collective effort, applied consistently over time scales that prove human persistence can relocate mountains one stone at a time. What would you prioritize if you found yourself responsible for construction in impossible conditions? Immediate survival, long-term effectiveness, or technical perfection? Let me know in the comments, because apparently we're all project managers now, and the mountain is still accepting applications for positions that require carrying impossible weights, up impossible grades while the weather conducts performance reviews, using standards that don't care about human limitations, comfort, or survival preferences. The wall stands as proof that some questions don't need answers. They need people willing to do the work required to make answers irrelevant, through achievements that speak for themselves in languages written in stone mortar and human determination that refuses to let impossibility have the final word in discussions about what can be accomplished when physics meets persistence, and persistence wins through superior commitment to the principle that some things are worth building regardless of cost.